Hello, and welcome back to the Sleep Alchemist. Tonight, our story begins under the soft, knowing glow of the harvest moon. A time of quiet work, whispered secrets, and long shadows in the countryside. Before we begin our journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find a sense of peace here. And in the comments, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. It's always a quiet joy to see our community of listeners gathering from all corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights. Find your comfortable space and let your breath slow to the rhythm of the night. Our story begins in the warmth of a stable. My world is not one of sunlit fields or bustling town squares. My world is a place of stone, shadow, and secrets. It is a world that smells of sulfur, of dried herbs, and of ancient paper that threatens to turn to dust at the slightest touch. I am Alara, and my kingdom is my father's laboratory. I do not remember a time before this room. My earliest memories are of the strange, beautiful shapes of glass that line the shelves, reaching up into the gloom like a forest of transparent trees. There are alembics with long, swan-like necks, coiled retorts that look like sleeping serpents, and rows upon rows of small, corked vials filled with powders and liquids of impossible colors. The deep, dangerous red of cinnabar, the brilliant green of vitriol, the milky white of mercury. They are my silent, beautiful, and sometimes frightening toys. My days are not like those of other girls I read about in my father's books. I do not learn embroidery or song. I learn the quiet, patient art of listening. I listen to the gentle hiss of the furnace in the corner, a beast that never sleeps. I listen to the soft, rhythmic thump-thump of the mortar and pestle as I grind dried wormwood into a fine, bitter powder. I listen to the rustle of my father's robes as he moves through the laboratory, a tall, gaunt shadow among other shadows. He is a great man, an alchemist, a seeker of the grand work. That is what the books call it. To me, he is simply Father, a man whose hands are permanently stained with the colors of his experiments, whose eyes, when they occasionally fall upon me, seem to look right through me, focused on a world I cannot see. He is a man possessed by a holy, terrible ambition, the quest for knowledge, for transformation, for a life that cheats death itself. Our conversations are brief, functional. Alara, more charcoal for the furnace. Alara, clean the beakers, but use the lye soap, not the common one. Alara, do not touch the sealed jar on the main table. It is unstable. I obey. I always obey. I move through this world of his, this sanctuary of forbidden knowledge, like a small, quiet ghost. My own world is found not in his experiments, but in his books. When my chores are done, I am allowed to read from his vast library. I lose myself in tales of Greek heroes, in the philosophies of Arab scholars, in the poetry of men who lived and died centuries ago. The stories are my only companions. They are my only window to the world outside these thick stone walls in the heart of Prague. Today, however, a piece of the outside world is coming to us. I know this because my father's energy has changed. There is a tension in the air, a coiled spring of anticipation. He has washed his hands 3 times, a rare act of vanity. He has even swept a small patch of the floor near the main table. These are signs that our patroness is coming. The patroness. She is a countess, a woman of great wealth and influence, whose gold finances my father's ceaseless work. She is the only visitor we ever have. I hear the first sign of her arrival. the distant clatter of carriage wheels on the cobblestones of the narrow street below. It is a sound so foreign, so intrusive, it makes me look up from the manuscript I am copying. My father hears it too. His back, which is always slightly stooped from bending over his work, straightens. He smooths the front of his dark, simple robes. A few moments later, there is a sharp, authoritative rap on our heavy oak door. Not the timid knock of a merchant or the shuffle of a messenger. It is the sound of someone who does not expect to be kept waiting. My father takes a deep breath and goes to open it, and the world changes. She enters the laboratory, not like a visitor, but like a queen entering her court. The first thing that enters is her scent. A rich, heady perfume of amber and exotic flowers. A scent so powerful it seems to wage war against the familiar chemical smells of my world, and wins. Then she appears. Lady Annalise. She is a vision of impossible color in our world of grey stone and dark wood. Her dress is of deep crimson silk that rustles with every step, a sound like fire itself. A string of pearls, luminous and white as milk, is coiled around her long, pale neck. She is beautiful, but it is a sharp, intelligent beauty. Her eyes are dark and knowing, and when they sweep across the room, they seem to take in every secret, every dusty corner, every flawed experiment, and find them all amusing. "Master Alchemist," she says, her voice a low, melodious sound that is both a greeting and a command. She pulls off her fine leather gloves, and her hands are pale and perfect, without a single stain. My father, the great scholar who converses with the ghosts of philosophers, simply bows his head. "My lady," he says, and his voice is different. The stern, academic tone is gone. In its place is a rougher, more human sound, a sound of something I do not have a name for. "Leave us, child," he says to me, without looking in my direction. His eyes are fixed only on her. I curtsy, my own eyes on the floor, and retreat to the small staircase that leads to my room above the lab. But as I go, I cannot help but feel the shift in the very air of the room. It is no longer a laboratory of quiet study. With her arrival, it has become something else, a stage. And I sense, with the strange intuition of a lonely child, that a play I do not understand is about to begin. My room is a simple cell, a stark contrast to the beautiful, dangerous chaos of the laboratory below. It contains only a narrow cot, a small wooden chest for my 2 dresses, and a single stool. There is no clutter here, no mystery. The walls are bare stone, cold to the touch even in summer. My father believes that a simple room encourages a disciplined mind. My mind, however, is anything but disciplined tonight. I sit on the edge of my cot, the sounds from the laboratory below, muffled by the thick stone floor. I can hear the low murmur of their voices, his a deep, serious rumble, hers a lighter, more musical counterpoint. I try to focus on the book I brought with me, a heavy tome on the properties of herbs, but the words blur before my eyes. My thoughts keep drifting back to the scene downstairs, to the scent of her perfume, to the way the air itself seemed to crackle with a strange energy when she entered the room. I trace the illustration of a belladonna plant with my finger. Deadly nightshade, beautiful but poisonous. It reminds me of her. A cold dread suddenly washes over me. The manuscript. The old, fragile manuscript on herbal properties that I was copying. In my haste to leave when she arrived, I left it on the small side table, not in the locked cabinet where it belongs. My father's most important rule is that all source texts must be secured before nightfall. The inks can fade, The parchment can absorb the dampness of the night. He would be furious. His anger is a quiet, cold thing, far more frightening than any shouting. I know I must go back down. My heart begins to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The thought of interrupting them, of intruding on their important discussion, terrifies me. But the thought of my father's cold, disappointed gaze in the morning terrifies me more. I slide off the cot, my bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. I inch my door open. The stone staircase leading down to the lab is a spiral of profound darkness, a descent into the unknown. I take a deep breath, hold it, and begin my journey down, one slow, careful step at a time. I press my body against the curved wall, trying to make myself smaller, invisible. As I get closer to the bottom, their voices become clearer. They are no longer murmuring. There is an edge to their conversation now, an impatience. Enough of your theories and your celestial alignments, Master Alchemist, the patroness, Lady Annalise, is saying. Her musical voice has a sharp, metallic quality now. The gold I provide demands results, not just endless talk of patience. What of the crimson elixir? You have been promising a breakthrough for months. The crimson elixir. I have read about it in my father's notes. The final stage of the great work. The key to transmuting not metal, but life itself. It is said to be a substance of immense power, capable of restoring youth and vitality. My father's voice replies, and it sounds defensive. The great work cannot be rushed, my lady. The final conjunction is delicate. It requires a perfect catalyst, a perfect fusion of opposing forces, the sun and the moon, the fire and the water, the masculine and the feminine principles. He is reciting from the texts. I know the words by heart, but as I press my ear closer to the slightly ajar door, I realize he is not just reciting. There is a tremor in his voice, a hidden current of emotion that has nothing to do with science. I find a hiding place. A tall, dusty rack of drying herbs, their strange, pungent scents filling my nostrils. From here, through the gaps between the hanging bundles of lavender and wolfsbane, I can see them. They are standing near the great furnace, its embers glowing a dull, angry red behind a small iron grate, casting a hellish light upon their faces. My father is holding a glass retort, explaining something about distillation. But she is not looking at the glass. She is looking at him. And then she does something that makes the air leave my lungs. She laughs. It is not the polite, musical laugh from before. It is a low, throaty sound of pure frustration. Oh, you and your principles, she says, and she steps forward, closing the distance between them. The scent of her perfume reaches even my dark corner. She places her hand directly over his on the workbench, stopping his work. A close-up of their hands, hers, pale, elegant, adorned with a single, dark jewel. His, stained with chemicals, the knuckles calloused, the nails permanently darkened, two worlds colliding in a single touch. Some elixirs cannot be found in a crucible, you know, she says, her voice now a low, dangerous whisper. Some require a different kind of heat, a different kind of fusion. My father stands frozen, a statue of a man. He stares down at her hand covering his. She moves closer still. You speak of the sun and the moon, she murmurs. Her lips now so close to his ear I can see them move in the firelight. But you stand here, a man of fire and intellect, and I am here. Am I not a catalyst? Is this not a conjunction of opposing forces? He does not answer. He cannot. And then she rises on her toes slightly, and he turns his head. I do not see the kiss itself. I see only what the firelight shows me. I see their two distinct silhouettes, his tall and gaunt, hers graceful and curved, suddenly merge against the wall. They become one single, writhing shadow, a creature of darkness and fire, locked in a moment of impossible, desperate fusion. There is no sound but the hiss of the furnace and the frantic, deafening roar of the blood in my own ears. I press my hand to my mouth to stifle the gasp that threatens to escape. My body is trembling. My world, the ordered, predictable world of books and herbs and quiet obedience, has just shattered into a million pieces. My father, my stern, intellectual, solitary father, who spoke only of logic and the pursuit of knowledge, that man is gone. In his place is this creature of shadow and flame, consumed by a passion I have only ever read about in forbidden poetry, a passion that seems as dangerous and as powerful as the elixirs he tries to create. I feel a profound, dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the stone floor beneath me has suddenly given way. I am witnessing the true alchemy, the transmutation of a scholar into a man, of a patroness into a lover. The shadow on the wall breaks apart. The moment, as intense and as brief as a lightning strike, is over. They stand apart now, breathing heavily in the sudden, thick silence. I don't wait to see more. I don't care about the manuscript anymore. I turn, scrambling backwards into the darkness of the stairwell, my hands slipping on the cold, damp stone. I half crawl, half run up the stairs, my own breath coming in ragged, silent sobs. I reach my room and slam the wooden door shut, the sound echoing in the stillness of the upper floor. I press my back against it, my body trembling uncontrollably. I slide down to the floor, my mind a blank, white-hot canvas, burned with the image of that single, monstrous shadow. The quiet sounds of the laboratory below, the gentle bubbling and hissing, are no longer the sounds of science to me. They are the sounds of a secret so large, so powerful, it feels as though it might bring the very walls of this ancient house crashing down around us. I do not know how long I remained there, huddled on the floor with my back pressed against the door, as if I could physically hold the secret in. The wood was cold and hard against my spine, a grounding reality in a world that had just dissolved into chaos. My body trembled, not from the chill of the stone room, but from the aftershock of what I had witnessed. The image of that single, monstrous shadow, flickering in the hellish light of the furnace, was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. My father, a man I thought I knew, a man whose life was governed by logic, by ancient texts, by the precise measurement of powders and liquids. That man had vanished, and in his place a stranger, a man of fire and passion, a man capable of a desperate, silent fury that I could feel even from my hiding place. Slowly, very slowly, the trembling in my limbs began to subside, replaced by a strange, cold clarity. The fear did not leave, but curiosity, its bolder, more reckless cousin, began to stir within me. I needed to understand. My ear, almost of its own volition, pressed itself against the thick oak of the door, listening for the sounds from the laboratory below. The silence was over. I could hear their voices again, low and murmuring, but the tone was different now. The raw, desperate energy was gone. What remained was a kind of weary intimacy, the sound of a storm that has passed, leaving a strange calm in its wake. I could not make out the words, only the rhythm of their conversation. His voice was a low, steady rumble. Hers, a soft, melodic counterpoint. But now, it held a note of finality, of business concluded. Then, I heard a sound that was both familiar and jarringly out of place in our world of quiet study. It was the unmistakable, heavy clinking of gold coins being poured onto a wooden surface. A sound of wealth, of power, of a transaction. A shiver went down my spine. This was not just a meeting of two lovers. This was something far more complicated. I heard the rustle of her silk dress, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I heard the scrape of a chair, her soft footsteps, and then the final, heavy groan of the great laboratory door opening and closing. The latch clicked shut. She was gone. And then, silence. A silence so profound, so heavy, it felt heavier than all the noise that had come before. I waited, my breath held tight in my chest. What would he do now? Would he return to his experiments, to the bubbling retorts and the smoldering furnace? I listened. For minutes that stretched into an eternity, there was nothing. Only the faint, steady hiss of the fire below. Then I heard it, a single, scraping sound of a wooden chair being pushed back. The sound of his heavy, weary footsteps crossing the stone floor. Then, the sound of his own door, the one leading to his private chambers, closing with that same air of finality. He too was gone. The laboratory was empty, the manuscript. The thought hit me like a splash of cold water. My forgotten task. The ancient, fragile text I had left out on the side table. My fear of my father's quiet anger returned, a familiar feeling in this new, terrifying landscape of emotion. I had to go back down. This time, my descent was different. It was not the fearful, hesitant creep of an intruder. It was the slow, deliberate walk of a ghost returning to the scene of a haunting. I carried no candle. The dying embers of the furnace cast a weak, pulsing red glow throughout the cavernous room, making everything look as if it were coated in a thin layer of blood. The laboratory was the same, and yet completely different. The air, which usually smelled of sulfur and herbs, now held a lingering, ghostly trace of her perfume. The spot where they had stood, near the furnace, seemed charged with a residual energy. I could almost still see their shadow on the wall. I walked to the side table, my eyes scanning the familiar clutter. And there was my book, safe, untouched. I picked it up, its familiar weight a small comfort. My mission was complete. I should have turned and left immediately, but I could not. My gaze was drawn to the main workbench, to the alembics and beakers, to the half-empty wine glasses they had shared, to the small leather pouch of gold coins she had left behind. It lay there, a dark, heavy blot on the wood, looking obscene in this house of scholarship. My father had not taken it. He had left it there. My eyes scanned the floor around the table, drawn by some instinct I did not understand. And then I saw it, a tiny glint of crimson light winking at me from the shadows near the leg of the table. I knelt down, my knees pressing into the cold, gritty stone. I reached out a trembling finger and touched it. It was a piece of jewelry, an earring, a single, perfect ruby, cut in the shape of a teardrop, set in dark, old gold. It must have fallen from her ear during their embrace. I picked it up. It was cold to the touch, but it seemed to pulse with a life of its own in my palm. It was the color of the crimson elixir my father was so obsessed with creating, the color of blood, the color of a passion so fierce it could burn the world down. This was it, the tangible proof, the secret I had witnessed, now made real, a cold, hard gem resting in my hand. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. It felt like holding a single, crystallized drop of all the adult emotions I did not understand: desire, danger, love, and betrayal. I closed my small hand around it, the sharp edges of the gold pressing into my skin. I forgot the manuscript on the table. I forgot everything. I turned and fled for the second time that night, up the winding stone stairs. I did not stop until the door to my own small room was closed and bolted behind me. I stood there, in the darkness, my back pressed against the wood, my own heart hammering a wild, frantic rhythm. Slowly, I uncircled my fist. I looked at the object in my palm. The ruby earring glowed in a sliver of moonlight from my window, a single, malevolent red eye staring back at me. The laboratory below was silent once more, but now I held its greatest secret in my hand, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my quiet, predictable world, the world of a simple alchemist's daughter, was over. I am back in my room, my sanctuary of stone and silence. But the silence is different now. It is not empty. It is heavy, filled with the echo of what I have seen, what I have heard. I sit on the edge of my cot, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles are white. My breath comes in small, shallow gasps. The world I knew, the world of predictable rituals and ancient, dusty texts, has been burned to the ground, and in its place something new and terrifying and strangely beautiful has begun to grow. Slowly, as if remembering a dream, I unclench my fist. There, in the center of my palm, lies the secret, the ruby earring. In the faint moonlight that struggles through my small, high window, the gem does not sparkle. It seems to absorb the light, glowing with a deep, internal fire of its own. It is the color of a dying ember, the color of blood, the color of the crimson elixir my father has so long pursued. I look at this small, perfect object, and I see not a piece of jewelry, but a single, crystallized drop of a passion so immense it could not be contained. My father. My mind struggles to hold the two images of him at once. The man I knew and the man I saw tonight. The man I knew was a scholar. His hands, though stained with chemicals, moved with the precision of a clockmaker. His voice was the dry rustle of old parchment. His passion was for knowledge, for a cold, intellectual truth hidden in the coded language of the stars and the elements. But the man I saw tonight, his hands were not precise. They were desperate. His voice was not dry. It was thick with a feeling I had no name for. And his passion, it was not for a distant, theoretical truth. It was for her, for the woman with the silk dress and the scent of a world I did not know. I look at the earring again. It is exquisite, flawless. It belongs in a velvet-lined box in a grand chamber. It does not belong here, on the rough stone floor of a dusty laboratory. And then I think of her, the patroness, Lady Annalise. I had always seen her as an intrusion, a creature of color and noise in our world of quiet gray, a force of will that commanded my father, a power he was beholden to for the gold that fueled his furnace. I had seen her as a danger. But now, a different picture forms in my mind. I remember the impatience in her voice when she spoke of the elixir. It was not the impatience of a demanding master, but of a desperate soul. I remember the look in her eyes as she watched my father. It was not the look of a superior, but of an equal, of someone who saw not just the great alchemist, but the man inside. Perhaps she too is in a cage, a beautiful, gilded cage of titles and duties, but a cage nonetheless. Perhaps in this dark, cluttered laboratory, surrounded by the strange smells and the promise of impossible transformations, she finds a freedom she cannot find in her own world. Perhaps my father's great work is her only escape, and perhaps he is hers. The ruby in my palm feels suddenly warm. I realize then that I have been a fool, a child, reading stories of good and evil, of saints and sinners. But the world is not a book. It is a laboratory. It is a place of volatile, beautiful, dangerous mixtures. My father is not a saint. The lady is not a sinner. They are simply two elements, fire and water, sun and moon, drawn together by a force they cannot control, creating a reaction that is both beautiful and terrifying. The crimson elixir. The words echo in my mind, the final stage, the key to life. I finally understand. It was never about a potion in a bottle. The crimson elixir they spoke of was not something to be created. It was something that was already happening. It was the dangerous, volatile, life-giving fusion of their two souls in this secret, shadowed world. It was their love. I close my hand around the earring one last time, its sharp edges a small, grounding pain. I slip off my cot and walk to the small wooden chest that holds my few belongings. I open the lid and place the earring inside, burying it beneath my simple wool dresses. The secret is safe now. It is mine to keep. I return to my bed and lie down, pulling the rough blanket over me. The trembling has finally stopped. The fear has not gone, but it has changed. It is no longer the fear of a child who has seen something forbidden. It is the quiet awe of a person who has just glimpsed the true, chaotic, and heartbreaking complexity of the human heart. My thoughts begin to slow. The laboratory below is silent. The fire in the furnace has likely died down to soft, sleeping embers. The great work has paused for the night. My mind drifts. I think of the colors I saw tonight. The deep, rich black of the shadows. The stark, honest white of the moonlight. The bright, dangerous gold of the coins on the table. And the deep, secret red of the ruby. The color of a heart's desire. The color of a hidden fire. A fire. A warm, glowing ember. A soft, red light. Fading, fading, quiet, sleep. The journey had been long, 2 days by rattling coach, from the smog and noise of London, and now, for the past several hours, this smaller, private carriage had been taking me deeper into a world that felt increasingly alien. The landscape had changed an hour ago. The gentle, rolling green hills of the south had flattened, then given way to something wilder, harsher. The moors. They stretched out on either side of the narrow road, a vast, empty expanse of bruised purple heather and grey, windswept grasses. The sky above was a heavy, uniform grey, a lid on a world that felt lonely and forgotten. There were no other carriages, no farmhouses, no signs of life save for a few hardy sheep that stared at us with ancient, indifferent eyes. The wind was a constant presence, a mournful sigh that seemed to whisper of old sorrows. I pulled my traveling cloak tighter around me, a sudden, inexplicable chill seeping into my bones. The advertisement had been brief, posted in a respectable London paper. Governess required for a young girl of 8 years, secluded country estate, generous salary. Secluded, I thought, was an understatement. This felt like the very edge of the world. I was leaving a life of genteel poverty, the daughter of a clergyman who had left me with little more than a good education and a pile of debts. This position at Blackwood Manor was not just a job, it was an escape, a lifeline. And yet, as the carriage continued its lonely journey, a sense of foreboding settled upon me, as thick and as grey as the fog beginning to roll in from the hills. Finally, after another hour, the driver pointed with his whip. "There she is, miss, Blackwood Manor." I leaned forward and looked out the small window, and my heart sank. It was not a house. It was a presence, a great, gaunt structure of dark grey stone that seemed to rise directly from the moorland, as if it were a natural, malevolent growth. It stood on a low hill, stark and imposing against the darkening sky. Ivy, black and thick as serpents, clung to its walls, and the many windows, dark and vacant, looked like empty eyes staring out at the desolate landscape. It was a house that did not welcome, it endured. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive and came to a stop before a massive oak door, studded with black iron. The world fell silent. The sound of the wind was gone, blocked by the sheer mass of the house. The silence that remained was heavy, oppressive, ancient. It felt as if no one had laughed here in 100 years. The great door opened before I could even step down from the carriage. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the hall within. She was tall and thin, dressed entirely in black, her grey hair pulled back into a severe, tight bun. Her face was a mask of stern duty. "Miss Eleanor Vance, I presume?" she said, her voice as crisp and as cold as the autumn air. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. His lordship is expecting you. This way." She did not offer to help with my trunk. She simply turned and led me into the great hall. I stepped inside, and a wave of cold, still air washed over me. The hall was enormous, the ceiling lost in shadows far above. A grand staircase, its banister carved with dark, grim-faced gargoyles, rose into the gloom. The only light came from a single, high window, and its weak, grey light did little more than illuminate the thick layer of dust that coated everything. The air smelled of old stone, beeswax, and something else. Something like dried flowers, a faint, ghostly perfume. "His lordship is in the library," Mrs. Gable stated, her footsteps echoing sharply on the stone floor. "Your pupil, Miss Rosamond, is in the nursery. You will meet her after you have spoken with the master. Your duties will begin in the morning. Your primary rule here is to maintain the quiet of the house. His lordship does not abide noise." She paused, her hand on a heavy door. "And one final matter. The west wing of the manor is closed. It has been for some time. The doors are locked. You have no reason to go there. Do you understand?" "Perfectly, Mrs. Gable," I replied, my own voice sounding small and thin in the vast space. She nodded once, then opened the library door. "Miss Vance, my lord." I stepped inside. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with books, thousands of them, their leather spines dark and silent. A large fire was burning in the hearth, but it seemed to give off no warmth, only a flickering, anxious light. And there, standing by the window, looking out at the bleak moors, was Lord Ashworth. He turned as I entered. I had been prepared for an older, sterner man, but he was young, perhaps no more than 35. He was tall and handsome, with dark hair and a face that looked as though it had been carved from marble by a master sculptor. But it was a sculpture of grief. His dark eyes were hollow, haunted, and they looked at me as if I were a distant object, something to be acknowledged, but not truly seen. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, quiet baritone that held no warmth, only a profound weariness. "Welcome to Blackwood. I trust your journey was tolerable." "It was, my lord." "Thank you," I managed to say. "Good," he said, turning his gaze back to the window. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms. You will have your meals with my daughter, Rosamond, in the nursery. I require silence in the evenings to conduct my work. You will find that we keep to ourselves here. I trust that will not be a problem." "Not at all, my lord." He nodded, a final, dismissive gesture. The audience was over. As Mrs. Gable led me out, I felt his eyes on my back, but when I dared a glance over my shoulder, he was once again just a dark silhouette against the grey light of the window, a man who seemed to be a ghost in his own home. My final introduction was to my charge, Rosamond. Mrs. Gable led me up the grand staircase to the second floor, down a long, cold corridor to the nursery. It was a large room, filled with beautiful, expensive toys that were all neatly arranged on shelves, looking as though they had never been touched. Sitting in a small chair by the window was a small girl, Rosamond. She had her father's dark hair, but her features were delicate, like a porcelain doll. She was not playing. She was simply staring out the window, at the same bleak, empty moors her father had been staring at. "Rosamond," Mrs. Gable said sharply, "this is your new governess, Miss Vance. Say hello." The little girl turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were large and dark, and they held a stillness, a watchfulness, that was unsettling in a child so young. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply looked, a long, silent, penetrating gaze. "I am very pleased to meet you, Rosamond," I said, forcing a warm smile. "I hope we shall become great friends." She said nothing. She just continued to watch me with those old, silent eyes. That night, alone in my large, cold bedroom, with the wind howling outside my window like a grieving spirit, I unpacked my small trunk. The silence of the house pressed in on me. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of held breaths, of unspoken words, of a deep, pervasive sorrow that seemed to have seeped into the very stones of Blackwood Manor. I thought of the stern housekeeper, the quiet, watchful child, and the handsome, heartbroken lord. I had come here seeking refuge, a new life, but I had a sudden, chilling feeling that I had not escaped a house of ghosts, but had simply entered a new one. The first weeks at Blackwood Manor passed in a haze of grey monotony. My life, once filled with the intellectual rigours of my studies and the quiet duties of caring for my late father, was now governed by a new, oppressive rhythm. It was a rhythm of silence, of routine, and of a profound, unshakable loneliness that seemed to be a part of the very air I breathed. Each morning began in the schoolroom. It was a large, cold room with a tall, narrow window that looked out onto the same bleak expanse of windswept moors. The only warmth came from a small, smoky fireplace that Mrs. Gable would light reluctantly each morning. My pupil, Rosamond, was a strange and silent companion. She was intelligent, I could see that much. Her work was precise, her handwriting neat. She learned her letters and her numbers with a quiet diligence, but she did not speak unless absolutely necessary. Our lessons were a one-sided conversation. I would speak of history, of geography, of poetry, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the still, cold room. She would listen, her large, dark eyes fixed on my face, her expression unreadable. She rarely asked questions. Instead, she would draw. Her sketches filled the margins of her notebooks, strange, intricate drawings of birds with broken wings, of leafless trees, of locked doors and winding staircases. They were the drawings of a child who lived in a world of shadows. Our daily walks were no different. We would bundle up in heavy wool coats and walk along the narrow paths that crisscrossed the moors. The wind was a constant companion, pulling at my bonnet, whipping colour into my cheeks. I would try to engage her, pointing out the hardy purple heather, the flight of a lonely hawk against the grey sky. "Isn't that beautiful, Rosamond?" I would ask. She would just nod, her gaze fixed on the ground, her small hand tucked tightly in mine. She seemed not to see the world around her, but to be listening to something else entirely, a sound only she could hear. He turned as I entered. I had been prepared for an older, sterner man, but he was young, perhaps no more than 35. He was tall and handsome, with dark hair and a face that looked as though it had been carved from marble by a master sculptor. But it was a sculpture of grief. His dark eyes were hollow, haunted, and they looked at me as if I were a distant object, something to be acknowledged, but not truly seen. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low, quiet baritone that held no warmth, only a profound weariness. "Welcome to Blackwood. I trust your journey was tolerable." "It was, my lord." "Thank you," I managed to say. "Good," he said, turning his gaze back to the window. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms. You will have your meals with my daughter, Rosamond, in the nursery. I require silence in the evenings to conduct my work. You will find that we keep to ourselves here. I trust that will not be a problem." "Not at all, my lord." He nodded, a final, dismissive gesture. The audience was over. As Mrs. Gable led me out, I felt his eyes on my back, but when I dared a glance over my shoulder, he was once again just a dark silhouette against the grey light of the window, a man who seemed to be a ghost in his own home. My final introduction was to my charge, Rosamond. Mrs. Gable led me up the grand staircase to the second floor, down a long, cold corridor to the nursery. It was a large room, filled with beautiful, expensive toys that were all neatly arranged on shelves, looking as though they had never been touched. Sitting in a small chair by the window was a small girl, Rosamond. She had her father's dark hair, but her features were delicate, like a porcelain doll. She was not playing. She was simply staring out the window, at the same bleak, empty moors her father had been staring at. "Rosamond," Mrs. Gable said sharply. "This is your new governess, Miss Vance. Say hello." The little girl turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were large and dark, and they held a stillness, a watchfulness, that was unsettling in a child so young. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply looked, a long, silent, penetrating gaze. "I am very pleased to meet you, Rosamond," I said, forcing a warm smile. "I hope we shall become great friends." She said nothing. She just continued to watch me with those old, silent eyes. That night, alone in my large, cold bedroom, with the wind howling outside my window like a grieving spirit, I unpacked my small trunk. The silence of the house pressed in on me. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of held breaths, of unspoken words, of a deep, pervasive sorrow that seemed to have seeped into the very stones of Blackwood Manor. I thought of the stern housekeeper, the quiet, watchful child, and the handsome, heartbroken lord. I had come here seeking refuge, a new life, but I had a sudden, chilling feeling that I had not escaped a house of ghosts, but had simply entered a new one. The first weeks at Blackwood Manor passed in a haze of grey monotony. My life, once filled with the intellectual rigours of my studies and the quiet duties of caring for my late father, was now governed by a new, oppressive rhythm. It was a rhythm of silence, of routine, and of a profound, unshakable loneliness that seemed to be a part of the very air I breathed. Each morning began in the schoolroom. It was a large, cold room with a tall, narrow window that looked out onto the same bleak expanse of windswept moors. The only warmth came from a small, smoky fireplace that Mrs. Gable would light reluctantly each morning. My pupil, Rosamond, was a strange and silent companion. She was intelligent, I could see that much. Her work was precise, her handwriting neat. She learned her letters and her numbers with a quiet diligence, but she did not speak unless absolutely necessary. Our lessons were a one-sided conversation. I would speak of history, of geography, of poetry, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the still, cold room. She would listen, her large, dark eyes fixed on my face, her expression unreadable. She rarely asked questions. Instead, she would draw. Her sketches filled the margins of her notebooks, strange, intricate drawings of birds with broken wings, of leafless trees, of locked doors and winding staircases. They were the drawings of a child who lived in a world of shadows. Our daily walks were no different. We would bundle up in heavy wool coats and walk along the narrow paths that crisscrossed the moors. The wind was a constant companion, pulling at my bonnet, whipping colour into my cheeks. I would try to engage her, pointing out the hardy purple heather, the flight of a lonely hawk against the grey sky. "Isn't that beautiful, Rosamond?" I would ask. She would just nod, her gaze fixed on the ground, her small hand tucked tightly in mine. She seemed not to see the world around her, but to be listening to something else entirely, a sound only she could hear, a single, ornate iron key. It was heavy and cold, and a fine layer of reddish rust coated its surface. It was unlike any of the other, simpler brass keys used in the rest of the manor. It was a key from another time, a key to a locked door, a key to the West Wing. I closed my hand around it, its cold, jagged edges pressing into my palm. That night, I did not wait for the scent of lavender or the sound of the phantom piano. The wind was quiet. The house was still. Armed with my single candle and the old iron key, I made my way back down the long, dark corridor. I stood before the great oak door to the west wing. It seemed even larger and more imposing in the darkness. My hand trembled as I raised the key to the lock. This was a transgression, a violation of the one clear rule I had been given. But I could not turn back. I inserted the key into the enormous iron lock. It was stiff, resistant. I had to use both hands to turn it, the sound of the old, rusty tumblers grinding and finally giving way with a loud click echoed through the silent corridor like a gunshot. For a moment, I froze, certain that the sound would bring Mrs. Gable or even the Lord himself running. But there was only silence. I took a deep breath, pushed the heavy door, and it swung open with a low, mournful groan, revealing a wall of profound, untouched darkness within. The sound of the lock turning was a cannon shot in the profound silence of the manor. For a heart-stopping moment, I was certain the sound would travel through the stone walls, rousing Mrs. Gable from her sleep, or summoning the Lord from his library. I stood frozen, my hand still on the cold iron key, my ears straining, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps. But there was nothing, only the low, mournful sigh of the wind outside and the frantic, silent beating of my own heart. I pushed the heavy door. It groaned in protest, a sound like a great beast woken from a long slumber. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over me, carrying a scent I now recognized. It was the faint, ghostly perfume of lavender, mingled with the dry, dusty smell of a place that has been sealed away from time itself. I raised my candle, its small, brave flame barely pushing back the immense suffocating darkness within. The light fell upon a long corridor, its walls lined with portraits covered in white dust cloths. They looked like a procession of silent, shrouded ghosts standing vigil in the dark. My own shadow, cast long and distorted by the candlelight, danced on the walls beside them, a nervous intruder in this forgotten world. Each step I took on the thick carpet of dust felt like a transgression. The floorboards beneath creaked and groaned, protesting my presence. This wing of the house was not derelict or ruined. It was preserved, held in a state of suspended animation, like a kingdom under a sleeping spell. At the end of the long corridor was another door, this one slightly ajar. A sliver of pale, silvery light escaped from within. Moonlight. Hesitantly, my heart pounding, I pushed it open and stepped inside. I found myself in what was clearly a lady's private chambers. A magnificent four-poster bed stood in the center, its velvet curtains drawn and tied back with silken ropes. A dressing table with a silver-backed brush and comb set sat by the window, the silver tarnished with a thin layer of grey. A book of poetry was left open on a small reading chair, as if its reader had just stepped away for a moment. Everything was covered in that same fine, grey dust, a delicate shroud over a life abruptly ended. And there, above the grand, cold fireplace, was a large portrait. It was not covered. It was the only thing in the room that seemed to have been cared for, its surface free of dust. It was a portrait of a woman of breathtaking beauty, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold both a deep intelligence and a profound sadness. She wore a dress the color of the evening sky, and there was a small, knowing smile on her lips. Lady Beatrice. I felt as though I was finally meeting the true mistress of this house, the silent queen of this kingdom of sorrow. I stood there, mesmerized, for I don't know how long, and then I heard it. Footsteps, steady, familiar footsteps, approaching in the corridor outside. My blood ran cold. It was Lord Ashworth. Panic seized me. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. My eyes darted around the room and settled on the heavy velvet curtains of the great window. Without a second thought, I slipped behind them, pulling the thick fabric around me, snuffing out my candle as I did. I stood there in the absolute darkness, my body rigid, trying to make my breathing silent. The door to the chamber opened. I watched through a tiny gap in the curtains as Lord Ashworth entered the room. He carried no candle. He moved through the moonlit darkness with a quiet, weary familiarity. He was not an intruder here. He was home. He did not seem to see the dust, the stillness. He walked to the center of the room, to the empty space before the fireplace, and he stopped. "Beatrice," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur. It was not the cold, formal voice I knew. This voice was different. It was warm and full of a deep, aching tenderness. "I apologize for being late tonight. The steward from the village kept me with his tedious reports." He paused as if waiting for a reply. The silence in the room was absolute. "Rosamond is well," he continued, his voice softer still. "She has a new governess, a Miss Vance. She seems capable. But the child is still so quiet, my love, so very quiet. She has your eyes. Did you know that? When she looks at me sometimes, it is as if I am looking at you." He sighed, a deep, shuddering sound that seemed to be pulled from the very depths of his soul. He walked over to a small, dust-covered pianoforte in the corner of the room. He lifted the lid and ran his fingers gently over the silent keys. And then he began to play. It was the melody, the same simple, heartbreakingly sad melody that had drifted through the corridors on the wind. He played it with a hesitant, gentle touch, his eyes closed. He was not performing. He was remembering. When the last note faded into the silence, he stood up. He walked to the center of the room, to the middle of a large, threadbare Persian rug, and he did something that made the world itself seem to stop. He held out his arms, one slightly raised, one extended to the side, as if to an invisible partner. He bowed his head slightly, and in the pale, ethereal light of the moon, he began to dance. A slow, graceful, heartbreaking waltz. Alone. He moved with a sad, perfect precision, his feet sure on the floorboards. He turned, he swayed, he guided his phantom partner through the empty spaces of the room. His eyes were not vacant. They were looking at the empty air before him with an expression of such intense love, such profound adoration, that I had to press my hand to my mouth to keep from crying out. My fear was gone. The terror of being discovered, the chill of this supposedly haunted place, it all evaporated, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful, it almost brought me to my knees. It was pity. It was awe. It was a shattering, all-consuming empathy. I was not watching a madman. I was watching a man so utterly, completely in love, that not even death itself could end the romance. The ghost of Blackwood Manor was not a terrifying spirit. It was not a malevolent presence. The ghost of Blackwood Manor was love, an undying, inconsolable, heartbreakingly beautiful love that refused to leave these rooms. I saw past the cold, stern master, past the grieving lord, and saw, for the first time, the man. A man so broken by loss that he had built a shrine to his own heart and came here each night to worship at its altar. He completed the final turn of the waltz, his movements slow and graceful. He bowed deeply to his invisible partner, his form a dark, sorrowful shape in the moonlight. I could have sworn I heard him whisper, "Good night, my love." Then he turned and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the chamber once again to its silence, its dust, and its ghosts. I remained behind the curtain for a long time, my body trembling, not with fear, but with the force of the emotion I had just witnessed. The room was silent again, but it was no longer an empty silence. It was filled with the lingering notes of their music, with the ghostly echo of their waltz, with the profound, undeniable presence of their love story. I slipped out from my hiding place. The iron key in my pocket felt heavy now, not with the weight of my transgression, but with the weight of a sacred secret. I crept out of the room, out of the west wing, and back to the safety of my own small chamber, my mind reeling. I stood at my window and looked out at the dark, windswept moors. My understanding of this house, of its master, and of the very nature of love and loss had been completely and irrevocably changed. I remained in my room for a long time after returning from the west wing, the old iron key feeling heavy in my pocket, not with the weight of a transgression, but with the weight of a sacred trust. The sun began to rise, and the grey, oppressive moors I had so feared upon my arrival now looked different. In the soft, gentle light of dawn, they seemed to possess a wild, melancholic beauty. The house itself, once a menacing stone beast, now felt like a great, sleeping guardian, holding its secrets close. The ghost of Blackwood Manor was not a spectre to be feared. It was a love to be revered, and I, it seemed, was now its unlikely keeper. The next morning, I descended the grand staircase with a new sense of purpose. The air in the house no longer felt heavy with a sorrow I could not name. It felt heavy with a story I now understood. When I met Mrs. Gable in the corridor, Her usual stern gaze seemed less intimidating. "You slept well, I trust, Miss Vance?" she asked, her voice as crisp as always. "I did. Thank you, Mrs. Gable," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. It was a very peaceful night. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, passed through her eyes before she nodded curtly and continued on her way. For the first time, I felt I was no longer an intruder here, but a part of its silent, complex tapestry. My approach to teaching Rosamond changed entirely. The silence that had once been a barrier between us now felt like a shared language. I put away the dusty books of grammar and arithmetic. Instead, I brought out her sketchpad. "Today, Rosamond," I said softly, sitting beside her in the cold schoolroom, "I do not want you to write. I want you to draw. Draw for me the lady in the great painting." She looked up at me, her large dark eyes searching mine for a long moment. Then, without a word, she picked up a piece of charcoal and began to draw. She did not draw a sad, ghostly figure. She drew a woman with a crown of flowers in her hair, smiling, surrounded by light. She was drawing not the woman who had died, but the mother she remembered. As she drew, I saw a small, faint smile touch her own lips for the first time. Our lessons, from that day on, were about memory, about stories, about beauty. And slowly, like a timid flower in a barren field, she began to bloom. Weeks passed. A quiet, unspoken understanding seemed to settle over the manor. Lord Ashworth was still a distant figure, but the haunted, hollow look in his eyes seemed to have lessened. Sometimes, our paths would cross in the long corridors, and instead of a curt, formal nod, he would pause for a moment, a silent question in his gaze, and I would offer him a small, respectful smile, my own silent answer. "Your secret is safe with me." One rainy afternoon, as Rosamond was quietly reading in a corner, I felt a pull towards the small, slightly out-of-tune pianoforte in the nursery. My own mother had taught me to play, a lifetime ago it seemed. My fingers, hesitant at first, found the keys, and I began to play. I did not play a nursery rhyme or a cheerful tune. I played the melody, the simple, heartbreakingly sad melody I had heard drifting from the West Wing. I played it softly, from memory, its notes filling the quiet room with a gentle melancholy. I was so lost in the music that I did not hear him enter. When the last note faded, I looked up, and he was standing in the doorway. Lord Ashworth. He was not angry. He was not surprised. He simply stood there, his face a mask of profound, vulnerable emotion. He looked at me, and for the first time, he truly saw me. "That was her favorite," he said, his voice low and thick with unshed tears. I did not pretend ignorance. I did not lie. I simply met his gaze and spoke the truth, as I now understood it. "It is a beautiful melody," I replied, my own voice soft. "It sounds full of memory." A long silence passed between us. It was not the oppressive silence of the house, but a new kind, a silence of shared understanding. He was not a lord, and I was not a governess. We were just two people who shared a secret knowledge of the woman who was the heart of this home. He gave me a small, sad, and deeply grateful smile. "Yes," he said, "it is." As he stood there, a small figure darted from the corner of the room. It was Rosamond. She ran to her father, not in her usual quiet way, but with purpose. She took his large hand in both of her small ones. Lord Ashworth looked down at her, startled. "That was Mama's song," Rosamond said, her voice clear and steady. It was the first full sentence I had ever heard her speak. I watched as Lord Ashworth's composure finally broke. A single tear, like the one I had seen on his cheek in the church, traced a path down his face. But this time, it was not a tear of pure grief. It was a tear of release. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around his daughter, holding her tightly. And for the first time since I had arrived, the great, silent, sorrowful house of Blackwood felt like a home. That night, as I lay in my own bed, I heard the faint notes of the piano again, drifting from the west wing. But this time, I did not feel fear or curiosity. I simply smiled. He was not dancing with a ghost anymore. He was conversing with a memory that was no longer a source of only pain, but one of loving remembrance. My role here was clear now. I was not meant to replace the lady of the house. I was not meant to fill the silence with noise. I was meant to be a quiet guardian, a keeper of the secret, a tender of the memory, a person who could help a father and daughter learn to live with their beautiful, beloved ghost. The wind outside the window sighed through the trees on the moors. It no longer sounded mournful to me. It sounded like a lullaby. The house was no longer haunted by sorrow, but consecrated by an undying love. And in that strange, sad, and beautiful house, I finally found a sense of peace I had not known I was looking for. My thoughts began to soften, to drift. The image of the father and daughter holding each other, the faint, sweet scent of lavender, the sad, beautiful notes of the piano, they all began to weave together, a gentle tapestry, a quiet melody, a story of love that never truly ends, a story that becomes a dream, a peaceful, gentle sleep. Not all ghosts are meant to be feared. Some are simply memories of a love so strong it refuses to be forgotten. They are the quiet guardians of the heart. Thank you for sharing this vigil with us tonight. I hope this story of a love that transcends even death has brought you a sense of profound peace. May your rest be deep and your own memories be gentle companions in your dreams. Sleep well.